Hi, this is Fawn, and I am the writer behind leastrestrictivelearning.com. And the idea that I wanted to discuss today is difference between an IEP and a 504 and which one might be more appropriate in each situation. Students with disabilities are entitled to an IEP or a 504 plan in the United States. And so the question is, why? Why should we go through this? And is there really any benefit my student is going to get out of it? Access to an IEP or a 504 plan, it is essential for students with disabilities to have equitable access to their education. These programs allow access to essential therapies and accommodations through the school to provide the support students with disabilities need to be successful. By the time my own son had turned 9 years old, I'd been through 6 different schools and created an IFSP in preschool, a 504 plan, and been through the IEP process at 4 public schools, including the initial process and renewal process, in addition to yearly rewriting. I'd also been through a process of getting a school to comply with an IEP and even bringing in a disability lawyer. So I do have some experience, some personal experience with all of this, and I do think that other parents may not have some of this information, especially if you were just starting out. And I really wanted to do this so that parents can be informed about the decisions that they're making for their children. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the reason students need an IEP or a 504 plan. The IEP and 504 plans are not the same, and they are not interchangeable. They are usually grouped together when discussing disabilities in the classroom, but they address different situations and have different accommodations that they may offer. A student who qualifies for an IEP or a 504 plan needs it. Simply put, a 504 plan is for a child with a medical diagnosis that may need some accommodations in the classroom to address the disability. Consider a child with celiac disease, and they may need the teacher to make accommodations in the classroom or with assignments that include gluten, or a student with a diagnosis of ADHD who needs extra time to complete assignments or a quiet room alone for test taking. On the other hand, a student who requires an IEP has gone through the testing process with the school and has been shown to need accommodations in order to participate in their own education. This may mean speech or occupational therapy, a class for students with disabilities, or specific instruction in addition to what is offered in the classroom. That last piece, specific instruction in addition to what is offered in the classroom, is what defines an IEP. IDEA stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is the federal law that provides special education services for children in the U.S. IDEA also provides funding for schools to provide these services. FAPE is Free and Appropriate Public Education. This is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and means that people with disabilities are also entitled to a public education free of cost. It also means that the school must provide an appropriate education. So an 8th grader reading at a 2nd grade level should not be in an 8th grade language arts class without additional accommodation. IDEA and FAPE both apply to the IEP as well as the 504 plan. In order to qualify for an IEP, a student must undergo a series of tests that may take some time to complete. The results are presented at a meeting with the parents where accommodations are set forth and goals are agreed on. Contrary to popular belief, it is not easy to qualify for an IEP, and schools are not willingly handing them out. An IEP requires a school to do extra work, track goals, and provide services. Most school administrations are not anxious to increase their workload. The IEP must contain the student's present levels, measurable goals, student progress, services the student will receive, modifications for staff, services to be received, accommodations needed, and how much time the student will be in the mainstream classroom. If you want to go into these sections of the IEP, I do have an article on that, and I'll go ahead and link that down below. If you are questioning whether your child actually needs the 504 plan or IEP they already have, the simple answer is they need it. Students do well when they are well supported, and if they are succeeding in school, it means you have found the right set of supports. Removing that support when the child is being successful is extremely detrimental. If you question whether your child needs an IEP or a 504, it's likely worth going through the testing for qualification. This is the decision-making process for the IEP and says whether a child needs. All right, so let's talk about the differences between an IEP and a 504. Although it is sometimes used interchangeably, IEP and 504 are not the same thing. In the simplest terms, the 504 plan is for students with a medical diagnosis, and IEP is for students with an educational diagnosis. It comes down to the difference between a medical and educational diagnosis. A medical diagnosis is given by a doctor, and an educational diagnosis is given by a school psychologist. For example, if your child has a diagnosis of autism going into school, it is a medical diagnosis, even if a psychologist was part of the process. Your child would get a 504 plan automatically, but to qualify for an IEP, they need to go through IEP testing to see if they qualify for an educational diagnosis. To get an educational diagnosis of autism, they need to experience symptoms of autism at school that prevent them from participating in their education. This may be getting overstimulated and escalating without intervention, needing specific instruction, or otherwise displaying symptoms of autism that prevent them from staying in the classroom. On the other hand, a 504 could be given to a student with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And this is how it is stated in the law. Usually, students have a prior diagnosis, but that isn't a requirement as long as it fits into the description above. In addition to the reasons for qualification, there are a number of differences in their application. Only an IEP will offer specialized instruction, setting goals, occupational therapy, speech therapy, placement in special education classrooms, and IEPs can even go on to include almost anything that the IEP team deems as necessary. Things that are covered by both an IEP and a 504 are accommodations in the classroom, due date extension, testing accommodations, and other disability-related accommodations. When deciding whether a 504 or an IEP will be the most appropriate, consider what your student may need the most help with, and whether a 504 would cover their needs in the long run. If specialized instruction or therapies may be needed, I encourage you to advocate for IEP testing. So with Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court decision, it held that it was unconstitutional to segregate children due to race. Then ESSA, or Elementary and Secondary Education Act, made it so there was equal educational access for all students regardless of family resources. In 1971, there were two cases, PARC versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and Mills v. Board of Education. Together, these made it so students with disabilities and those considered exceptional, including mental and learning disabilities as well as behavioral issues, must be placed in publicly funded schools, and made it illegal to deny those students an education. In 1972, it was found that 8 million children required special education. 3.9 million received what they needed, which is less than half. 2.5 million were not receiving a proper education, and 1.75 million weren't even in school. In 1975, what was later known as IDEA finally passed and said any school receiving money from the federal government must provide a free and appropriate public education. In 1976, services were included to mean from birth, and that the IEP came around and gave parents a say in their disabled children's education. In 1990, TBIs and autism were added to the list of disabilities that qualify. It was also amended that there must be a transition period and plans for students leaving public education and progressing into adulthood. Further instruction was given that disabled students must have access to the same curriculum as their non-disabled peers. The state of disability access to public education before IDEA was passed answers the primary question we have here. Why should students have an IEP? Because without an IEP, most children were not receiving adequate education. Next, I wanted to talk about FAPE. Now, FAPE stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education, and is frequently quoted along with the least restrictive learning environment. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means that the school may not force parents to pay for an education for their child. FAPE is part of IDEA. Prior to IDEA, parents were required to pay for extra services their children may need. It means that if a child requires speech therapy, the school must pay for it and cannot ask parents for this. It means that the education given must be appropriate, teaching up or down to the needs of the child. A fourth grader who cannot read is not allowed to be pushed forward to a standard fifth grade classroom, but should instead be given specific instruction in reading and other subjects at the level that is appropriate for them. All right, so let's talk about who qualifies for an IEP. IDEA has 3 different categories for disability: autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. A child must only qualify under one of the above to be eligible to receive an IEP. However, the disability must be shown to impact their ability to participate in their own education or otherwise require specialized instruction. Now, you will note that ADHD is not on this list. ADHD may qualify under other health impairment, otherwise known as OHI. Now, OHI can include many different diagnoses, even ones unrelated to an ability to learn, such as leukemia. It can also include any number of additional diagnoses such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. Now, I do see this said a lot where people say that, oh, they're just handing out IEPs all over the place today. You know, this is a common misconception that schools are handing out IEPs to as many kids as possible. See, the truth of the matter is parents must advocate and request in very specific terms the testing the school must perform in order to qualify for an IEP. After testing is performed, they must meet specific criteria under one of the 13 qualifying conditions listed in the section above. Simply having a diagnosis isn't enough for an IEP. There must be something specific they need help with due to that disability. If your child has no diagnosed disability, it does not preclude you from requesting an evaluation. It may make targeting the concern a little more tricky, but the process is the same whether or not there's a current diagnosis. Schools do receive additional funding from IDEA for students currently on an IEP, and this makes some people think schools are just handing them out. However, IDEA is chronically underfunded, and the requirements that an IEP puts on the school can be burdensome from the perspective of the school administration. Teachers and parents work hard together to get the children the best education they possibly can, but sometimes it feels like the school administration is not part of the team and it's an adversary instead of an ally. So let's talk about that choice, whether you think the child needs an IEP or a 504. If you are trying to make a decision whether your child needs an IEP or a 504 plan at all, or deciding between the two, I thought of a few questions to ask yourself. Does the child have a diagnosed disability? If yes, go back and check under the above categories. If they have one of the disabilities that qualify for an IEP, check under those categories of disabilities that qualify for an IEP and see if their disability is one of them. If it is, and you're considering an IEP, I highly recommend having the school do the testing. If they don't have a current diagnosis, is the child falling behind academically? If yes, consider what they need and are not getting, and whether it falls under 504 or IEP. Being behind academically itself is not a reason to be on IEP. In fact, children that are ahead of their peers academically can be on an IEP. Does the child need speech or occupational therapy? If the student is getting therapy outside of school, there is a good chance they will qualify for an IEP with therapy at school. Speech therapy can be social conventions, word usage, and more. Occupational therapy can be how to hold a pencil, sensory support, and many other things. Does the child need gifted services? If the student requires services related to being gifted, this can be covered on an IEP. Many gifted children also experience other areas of qualification for the IEP. So if they are gifted and struggling, it may be reason enough to request IEP testing. Has the student already been on a 504 plan and more support is needed? As we talked about earlier, there are many differences between a 504 and an IEP. Many additional services are available on an IEP that are not on a 504. If you think the student would benefit from one of those, request IEP testing. Has the teacher tried multiple alternatives and feels they need additional support? This in itself is a reason to get IEP testing for your child. Parents and teachers many times work together to identify that a child needs testing for an IEP. Would extra time on assignments and a quiet testing space be sufficient? If so, a 504 may be a better option, and you can have these accommodations on a 504 plan. Does the child need support outside the classroom and inside the classroom? If all supports can be provided in the classroom, a 504 may be appropriate. This means no therapy, no special instruction, no technology, no aid is needed, then the student only requires allowances made by the teacher. If this is true, a 504 is where you should start. If any of these are needed, get IEP testing done. Does the child's behavior keep them from access to the curriculum? Behavior is communication. And so if the student's behavior is keeping them from academics, they need more support than is currently available and need IEP testing. This may be spending all their time in a calm down corner or getting sent to the principal's office frequently. Many students on IEPs are behind academically, and they get specially designed instruction in order to get access to the curriculum. But even students who are on schedule or ahead can qualify for an IEP. The individual education plan is just that. It is individualized. Now, personally, I was told my son would not qualify for an IEP and that insisting on testing would waste everyone's time and keep other students from getting the services they needed. However, the school was calling me multiple times a week to pick him up due to behavior concerns, and he was spending very little time in the classroom. I was told this because my son was ahead academically. There's no way he will qualify for services, were the exact words that came from the school principal. I had to insist they test him anyways. When the testing came back, he qualified for the IEP under multiple categories. Now, I really hate the wording of the emotional disturbance, and I believe in some states they have changed that. But you can look at when they say emotional disturbance, you can read that more as problems manifesting with behavior. Because remember, behavior is communication. And even if they are acting out and it doesn't appear that they're having problems academically, this behavior might be masking it, and you may need to dig into it a little bit further. So if a student's behavior is keeping them from their education, I highly recommend requesting IEP testing. And to be perfectly honest, if you are sitting there considering whether your child may need IEP testing, I just strongly recommend getting that done. Many parents don't know what is going on in the classroom, and how could they? If the little information that you have from your students and the school says that you may need to pursue an IEP for your child, I recommend following that instinct and requesting that testing. You will go over the testing with the rest of the IEP team and make a decision together as to whether the student needs an IEP or not. And if you are looking for information to decide between an IEP and a 504 plan specifically for a child identified as ADHD, I did write an article on that, and I will go ahead and link it in the description below. Thank you for joining me today, and if you have questions or ideas for future videos, please go ahead and use the comment section down below, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good one, guys.